On April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth fatally shot the president, Abraham Lincoln, while Lincoln was watching a highly anticipated performance of the popular play, Our American Cousin. The aftermath of Lincoln's assassination resonated across the country, generating a ripple effect that would have vast ramifications for the future of the United States. Today, we're discussing the direct aftermath of Abraham Lincoln's assassination. Okay, let's travel back to one of America's darkest days. The night of April 14th should have been like any other at Ford's Theater. The extremely popular play, Our American Cousin, staged what they truly believed would be a massively successful performance that night. Knowing Lincoln would be attending that night, the players even changed a line in the play as sort of a shout-out to the president. The line, "Well, you're not the only one who wants to escape the draft," was delivered as, "The draft has already been stopped by order of the president." This was allegedly quite hilarious. And, as the audience erupted with laughter, John Wilkes Booth seized his opportunity. Booth was an actor, and he knew the play well. He knew the joke was coming and bided his time, knowing the laughter would mask the sound of his Derringer pistol. When the moment came, he snuck into Lincoln's box and fired. He got into a stab fight with Henry Rathbone, an Army officer who had been sharing the president's box, and either jumped or was thrown to the stage below, shattering his leg. As Booth fell to his debut on the Ford Theater stage, Booth shouted Virginia's state motto, Sic semper tyrannis, which is Latin for "thus always to tyrants," for those of you who don't speak Latin. He then beat a hasty retreat, well, as hasty as a one-legged man can be. Despite the broken limb, Booth managed to escape and stay on the run for 12 days. Members of the 16th New York Cavalry pursued Booth, finally catching up to him on April 26th. The manhunt would be one of the largest in American history. Booth met up with a co-conspirator, David Harold, and eventually made his way across the Potomac into more friendly territory. Authorities eventually found them taking refuge in a barn belonging to Richard Garrett of Bowling Green, Virginia. To draw him out, the soldiers set the barn ablaze, which is a surefire way to get someone to come outside. Pun intended. Booth was forced out into the open and was immediately gunned down by the cavalry. They even stabbed Booth's body with a knife to make sure his ticket had been thoroughly punched. Booth's remains were taken back to Washington, D.C., where they were placed under heavy guard in the White House's state dining room. Apparently, they were worried someone might steal him, or that he was going to turn into a zombie. After his death, a funeral train transported Abraham Lincoln's body across the United States to its final burial location in Springfield, Illinois. The train stopped at 180 different cities, like a Van Halen tour. On each stop, Lincoln's coffin was placed in a town hall where crowds of people waited in line for hours to pay their respects to the president. Lincoln was buried on Easter, which was declared a national day of mourning in his honor. Despite its ties to Lincoln's assassination, Our American Cousin remained a popular play. So popular, in fact, that 1 year after the tragedy at Ford's Theater, John Sleeper Clark, who happened to be John Wilkes Booth's brother-in-law, illegally staged a version at New York City's Winter Garden Theater. That's a real Kato Kalin move. Even though he advertised the show in the newspaper, he hadn't actually paid for the rights to stage the play. Clark had poached the play from Laura Keene, a successful actress who ran Our American Cousin for 150 successful nights at her own theater. Unlike Clark, she actually possessed the rights, so she sued Clark. This did little to prevent Clark from continuing to stage his own version, even as courts worked on the case. The dude was desperate to make some money off his notorious brother-in-law. Following Lincoln's assassination, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, had to fill the gap left by the great man, and it was a pretty big stovepipe hat to fill. Furthermore, Johnson didn't exactly agree with Lincoln's vision for the future of America. Consequently, he tried his best to veto some of the Reconstruction amendments. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, better known as the Reconstruction Amendments, came about shortly after the Civil War. Intended to aid the country in its long road to recovery, these amendments would become some of the most important in the document's history. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and established an end to the practice in the United States, stating, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." Wait, what was that "except" part? That doesn't seem like it belongs in a law banning slavery. The 14th Amendment provided citizenship to former slaves. It included two pivotal provisions: all persons born or naturalized in the United States, and the clause, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protections of the laws." Finally, the 15th Amendment gave Black Americans the right to vote and prevented any state from taking that right away. The newly minted President Johnson didn't take long to raise objections to Amendment 14. His objections ranged from believing each state should decide who could vote to not wanting to pass an amendment until the Confederate states were again part of the Union. Johnson ultimately vetoed the 14th Amendment, but Congress overrode his veto, and the amendment became law. Johnson kept clashing with Congress until they'd finally had enough and impeached him. He came within one vote of being removed from office. Not the best performance review. Eventually, the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 allowed the Southern states to become part of the United States again, serving an integral role in United States history. Although the laws allowed people to marry freely and own property, the subsequent years were marred by oppression of Black Americans with the passing of Jim Crow laws by some states and local governments, with many of those laws persisting until the 1960s. Meanwhile, President Andrew Johnson went on to serve a single presidential term and went down in history for his inept political moves. Although most of us only know the penny as the tiny Lincoln portraits that collect in the sock drawer, they didn't take on their current form until after Lincoln's death. The first pennies contained an image of a woman with flowing hair, dubbed Lady Liberty. They were also made from pure copper, rather than the copper zinc blend it contains today. Around 1857, the U.S. Mint began making smaller pennies composed of copper and nickel. These pennies had a flying eagle image instead of that woman who'd held the role for nearly a century, because America had a thing with eagles. Fast forward to 1909 when Victor David Brenner became a designer for the U.S. Mint. Brenner was a bit of a trailblazer when it came to coins. He designed the first coin to have a real person on it. In this case, Brenner chose to depict President Lincoln based on a conversation he had about a Lincoln plaque with President Theodore Roosevelt. This new penny changed everything. Roosevelt loved the idea of having faces on coins, possibly because he assumed his face would one day be featured on one. The penny underwent several changes over the years, first containing ears of wheat opposite President Lincoln's profile, followed by the Lincoln Memorial until 2008, when penny designs fluctuated with 4 different designs. For many of us, President's Day is just like any other Monday, except we don't get any mail and we can't go to the bank. Nobody gets together to sing president carols or exchange gifts beneath the cherry tree. But the holiday began as a celebration of George Washington's birthday. It wasn't officially altered to include Lincoln's big day until the late 1960s. Before that year, the holiday was celebrated on February 22nd. It was changed to the third Monday in February following the Uniform Monday Holiday Act of 1968, and was extended to honor Lincoln, born on February 12th, and George Washington, born on February 22nd. The tradition continues today, although 13 states don't observe this holiday, including Florida, Georgia, Iowa, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Delaware, Wisconsin, Louisiana, Rhode Island, North Carolina, New Mexico, and Ohio. The time between Lincoln's assassination and the invention of television isn't as long as you might think. For instance, fax machines already existed by the time the Civil War broke out. The Confederacy could have potentially faxed its surrender to Appomattox, except there wasn't a Kinko's there yet. The first televisions began to roll out in the 1920s, only about 50 years after Lincoln got whacked. For perspective, that's roughly the same amount of time between the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the third Hangover movie. And some early popular genres of TV shows were quiz shows and interview shows. Consequently, a man who had witnessed Lincoln's fate at Ford's Theater was actually on a TV quiz show in the 1950s. A 1956 episode of I've Got a Secret, a panel quiz show in which the panelists were tasked with guessing a contestant's unbelievable secret, featured 95-year-old Samuel J. Seymour. And Seymour's secret was that when he was 5 years old, he happened to be in the audience at Ford's Theater when Lincoln was shot. As he told the panelists and audience that day, he saw Booth leap from the stage and break his leg. Because he was a little kid, he didn't realize the significance of what he had witnessed. He just remembered being concerned for the person who fell out of the balcony. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to Ulysses S. Grant at Virginia's Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the Civil War. During the final decisive battles of the war, many men lost their lives as the Confederacy desperately tried to fight against the Union troops that overran them. But on that fateful day in 1865, General Lee's surrender set the precedent for other massive surrenders that led to the official end of the war. Today, we're exploring what happened during the final hours of the Civil War. The terms of this video are unconditional and immediate. The bloodiest war in U.S. history almost ended a few days earlier, when Lee's officers pleaded with the general to surrender. The soldiers were ragged, starving, and ready to quit. But the general was stubborn, declaring the South had sacred principles to maintain and rights to defend. Ulysses S. Grant sent Lee a note to remind him how hopeless pushing on would be. But Lee pressed on, knowing it was hopeless. Over the course of 4 bloody years, Union and Confederate troops clashed in battle after battle. But both sides were growing weary. By April of 1865, James Longstreet, a close confidant of General Robert E. Lee, informed the general that the beginning of the end was now at hand, following several Confederate losses. The push for Lee to surrender came from many of his fellow officers and subordinates. On April 7, 1865, his closest aides confronted him. General Long told him, perceiving the difficulties that surrounded the army and believing its extraction hopeless, a number of the principal officers, from a feeling of affection and sympathy for the commander-in-chief, and with a wish to lighten his responsibility and soften the pain of defeat, volunteered to inform him that, in their opinion, the struggle had reached a point where further resistance was hopeless, and that the contest should be terminated and negotiations opened for a surrender of the army. But both Lee and Longstreet were dead set on proceeding, with Longstreet urging Confederate forces to fight on. Lee forged ahead, and the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse began. By 1865, the Confederate Army was in shambles. Confederate General John Brown Gordon recalled, the Army of Northern Virginia had become the mere skeleton of its former self. This assessment did very little to discourage Lee. Instead, the general rode everywhere, encouraging soldiers to keep up with the war effort. As Gordon later wrote, Lee was often exposed to great danger from shells and bullets during these rides. Eventually, his officers recommended surrender, to which Lee responded negatively, insisting they must continue fighting. For Gordon, Lee knew the soldiers' devotions to the cause and their devotion to him, but he was not ready to consider the necessity for surrender. But none of that mattered at Appomattox when Ulysses S. Grant stepped up to the plate. Following a debate over whether he should surrender, Lee decided to carry on the fight. Meanwhile, Union General Ulysses S. Grant was cooking up a plan to stop General Lee. Grant knew the Confederate soldiers were running on empty. After speaking with a captured Confederate general the previous night, he learned everything he needed to know to set the stage for the war's end. The general told Grant, General Ewell had said that when we had got across the James River, he knew their cause was lost, and it was the duty of their authorities to make the best terms they could, while they still had a right to claim concessions. The Confederate soldiers knew they were doomed and continued their fruitless campaign to convince Lee to surrender. General Grant, sensing an opportunity to take control of the situation, sent a note to Lee from across the battlefield. Per Longstreet's account from the battle, a flag of truce appeared under torchlight in front of Mahone's line, bearing a note to General Lee. Speaking of that note, Before he was the 18th President of the United States and advocated heavily for civil rights for everyone, Grant was a true leader on the battlefield. In his April 7th note to Lee, Grant wrote, "The results of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia in this struggle. I feel that it is so, and regard it as my duty to shift from myself the responsibility of any further effusion of blood, by asking of you the surrender of that portion of the Confederate Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General." Lee disagreed with Grant about the hopelessness of his army's plight and wrote back, "General, I have received your note of this date. Though not entertaining the opinion you express of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia, I reciprocate your desire to avoid useless effusion of blood, and therefore, before considering your proposition, ask the terms you will offer on condition of its surrender. R.E. Lee, General." Correspondence between the two generals continued as Lee retreated to the west, eventually leading to the famous meeting at Appomattox. But there were more hurdles to overcome before the fateful meeting would take place. As the war was winding down, Lee's army began to show signs of crumbling, and a Union victory was at hand. Grant's troops saw victory within their sights. With the tactical advantage on their side and their spirits high, they marched as fast as they could without a single straggler among them. As Grant would later write in his memoirs, Union troops moved with alacrity and without any straggling. They began to see the end of what they had been fighting 4 years for. Nothing seemed to fatigue them. They were ready to move without rations and travel without rest until the end. General Philip Sheridan, who ran a Union cavalry force, outran Lee's forces and blocked their retreat. At the end of it all, Sheridan cut Lee's army off from provisions and took 6,000 prisoners in the area of Sailor's Creek. Such escapades became the catalyst for increased Confederate deserters and Lee's eventual surrender. On the morning of April 9th, Sheridan sent a note to Union officer Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, reading, "I have cut across the enemy at Appomattox Station and captured 3 of his trains. If you can possibly push your division up here tonight, we will have great results in the morning." When he wasn't busy crushing the South's food supplies or seizing rail lines to prevent travel, Sheridan led his cavalry on a mission to rout Confederate troops. Meanwhile, Grant and Lee's correspondence continued, with Lee sending another note to the Union general the previous night, after receiving Grant's correspondence late in the evening. "I did not intend to propose the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia, but to ask the terms of your proposition. To be frank, I do not think the emergency has arisen to call for the surrender of this army. But as the restoration of peace should be the sole object of all, I desired to know whether your proposals would lead to that end." Lee agreed to meet with Grant at 10 a.m. the following day, but Grant wasn't keen on the idea. A few more exchanges followed, culminating in General Gordon ended up leading one final desperate charge against the Union Army, capturing 2 pieces of Union artillery in the process. Gordon later wrote of his pride in the battle, saying, "The brave boys in tattered gray cheered as their battle flags waved in triumph on that last morning." But as Gordon and his soldiers celebrated, Union troops continued to advance. The troops had marched through the night for the sole purpose of cornering Lee's army. It was risky, but it worked. Grant reported that his division moved so fast that it surprised the enemy as they awoke that day. As Grant later reflected, this led to a sharp engagement that surrounded Robert E. Lee's army and cut them off from supplies. The battle ultimately ended with Lee waving a white flag. He was a bit melodramatic about it, too. At the end of it all, he declared, "There is nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." On April 9th, Grant and Lee sat in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house and negotiated the terms of the Confederacy's surrender. On the afternoon of April 9, 1865, Grant wasn't exactly dressed for the end of a war. He didn't expect his efforts to pay off so quickly and was dressed in what he called rough garb. He was ready when Lee waved the white flag, even if some Union troops suspected it to be a ruse to allow some Confederate soldiers to run away. But it was no ruse, and a few hours later, the 2 generals held their fateful meeting in the McLean house just outside of Appomattox. Lee showed up in full military regalia, complete with a valuable sword. Reflecting on the meeting, Grant later recalled, "In my rough traveling suit, I must have contrasted very strangely with a man so handsomely dressed, 6 feet high, and of faultless form." In the parlor of McLean's home, Grant and Lee discussed the terms of surrender alone. After their initial conversation, they were joined by other officers. General Horace Porter described the scene. We entered and found General Grant sitting at a marble-top table in the center of the room, and Lee sitting beside a small oval table near the front window, in the corner opposite to the door by which we entered, and facing General Grant. They quietly let themselves in as the surrender talks continued. During the surrender talks, Grant rapidly wrote down his terms for Lee's surrender. As he looked at Lee, he stopped to look at the ornate sword at the officer's side. As he did so, Grant decided requiring Confederate officers to surrender their swords would be an unnecessary humiliation. Having successfully secured a surrender, he didn't want to deprive them of their baggage, swords, and horses. So he added a line to the official terms of surrender, stating, "This will not embrace the sidearms of the officers, nor the private horses or baggage." Following a review of Grant's terms, Lee penned his own letter agreeing to them. The two generals shook hands, and Lee walked to the front steps of McLean's home. As he stood on the lowest step, he gazed in the direction of the valley, rubbing his hands together absently. Lee didn't notice the group of Union officers who respectfully stood as he walked. Porter, who observed the event, described it as a solemn occasion. As Lee walked away, Grant emerged from the house and saluted the former Confederate general with his hat. Lee returned the gesture and rode off into the sunset to break the news of his surrender to those formerly under his command. The surrender at Appomattox marked the end of the American Civil War, paving the way for a cessation of hostilities, a reunion for the country, and the Reconstruction that would follow. With the agreement for surrender secured, Grant sent a telegraph to Washington, informing them of the tremendous news. He told them, "General Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia this afternoon on terms proposed by myself." He'd later write in his memoir that his men began firing a 100-gun salute to celebrate the victory. This did not sit well with Grant, who sent word to have it stopped. He explained the Confederates were now prisoners, and he did not wish to celebrate their downfall. But he was relieved the war was over and prepared himself for the historical future he had ahead. Although the surrender marked the end of hostilities between the two armies, isolated skirmishes continued for a few weeks afterward. But Grant accomplished the impossible task of convincing Lee to surrender, bringing the war to a decisive conclusion. Upon completing his mission, Grant told his men, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again. The rest, as they say, is history." Abraham Lincoln was possibly America's greatest president. After being assassinated at Ford's Theater on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln became one of the first celebrities in American history to be embalmed. You would think Lincoln's body would be treated with respect after that fateful day. In a way, he was. But in another way, the treatment of Lincoln's body changed everything about funerals in the U.S. forever. Today, we're going to take a look at how Abraham Lincoln's assassination created the multi-billion-dollar American death industry. Okay, now, thank you for coming, and if you would like to pay your respects, please watch this explainer video. Prior to the Civil War, Americans had relatively simple ways of dealing with the dead. They would wash them, dress them up in something nice, and light some candles around the body in the hopes of hiding the stench. After that, friends, relatives, and jaded ex-lovers might stop over to say goodbye one last time. Then, once it was at the cemetery, the casket, which was usually a simple wooden box, would be lowered into the earth. People would say some nice things, and for the most part, that was it. A person's journey on this earth was over. No fuss, no muss. Now, let's go have some potato salad at the wake. Given that there were Americans on both sides of the conflict, the Civil War was by far the bloodiest confrontation the country had ever seen. That meant there was suddenly a huge number of the unliving laying about. Of course, the lifeless decompose quickly, so most soldiers were just abandoned on the battlefields to decompose. That was acceptable for many folks, but not everyone wanted to return to the earth in whatever random spot they fell. Embalming was invented in Europe in the 1830s, and by the time the Civil War kicked off, it had made its way to America. Some of these newly minted embalmers would approach soldiers who were about to go into battle and offer their services, if they might need them. While you have to respect the hustle, you probably won't be too surprised to hear that the military considered this bad for morale and ended the practice. But soldiers weren't the only people who could choose to be embalmed. Many families, especially rich northern ones, often paid to have their loved ones returned to them. In order to make the long journey without rotting, the fallen soldiers had to be embalmed. It is estimated that 40,000 out of the 600,000 fallen soldiers went through the embalming process. As the demand for embalming grew, more and more men, and given the time period, it was basically only men, got involved. However, as with nearly every profession, not every embalmer was on the up and up. Families were so desperate to get their loved ones back home to be buried that some embalmers started price gouging. The military offered generous bounties for the embalmed, $30 for a soldier and $80 for an officer, which translates to roughly $900 to $2,500 modern dollars. That being the case, it wasn't unusual to see embalmers literally fighting for fallen soldiers after the battles were done raging. And I thought Black Friday sales were bad. It eventually got so bad that the War Department had to issue General Order No. 39, which stated that anyone who wanted to interact with those soldiers had to have a special license. It also set the price for embalming services. Unfortunately, this wasn't decreed until March of 1865, when the war was almost over. So unscrupulous embalmers thrived for most of the conflict. But better late than never. President Lincoln would have been familiar with embalming by the time it was his turn to undergo the process. In fact, the very first casualty of the Civil War was actually embalmed. His name was Colonel Elmer Ephraim Ellsworth, and he was a friend of Lincoln's. He was taken out on May 24, 1861, shot after taking down a Confederate flag from the top of a hotel in Alexandria, Virginia. An embalmer named Dr. Holmes approached Lincoln and offered to do the embalming for free, probably just wanting to show off his new technique. The coffin was even made with a special window so you could see Ellsworth's face and chest. Thousands of people turned out to see the colonel in Washington and New York, and he actually wasn't buried for 10 days. The embalming process did its job, but it still wasn't foolproof. The New York Times even reported at the time that Ellsworth's face had a livid paleness. To be fair, that's how the New York Times describes every performance by the band Coldplay. While not perfect, Lincoln must have liked the idea of embalming, since when his 11-year-old son Willie passed away less than a year later, the Lincolns asked that Willie go through the same process. This let them keep their son in the White House longer and allowed them to grieve. Since embalming was such a new science, it was still fairly rudimentary, and not much like the far more complex procedures bodies go through today. Even when President Lincoln was put through the process, they didn't do that much to him. It was up to Dr. Charles Brown and Dr. Harry Cattell to make the president, who, don't forget, had just been shot in the back of the cranium, look decent. First, they flushed out his lifeblood. Then they pumped in a special embalming fluid invented by Brown. Interestingly, formaldehyde wasn't used for embalming yet. Lincoln was then dressed in a suit and made as presentable as possible. Cattell even traveled with the president's funeral procession, just in case he needed any touch-ups on the long road to his burial. Making sure Lincoln remained dignified was a top priority. Lincoln was so beloved by the American people that Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, decided people would certainly want to see him one last time and pay their respects. Prior to embalming, Lincoln would have succumbed to the elements only after a few days. But going through the process meant he could be taken through a huge swatch of the country on a tour that lasted for weeks. Lincoln was put on a train to kick off the farewell tour. It traveled over 1,600 miles, stopped in 7 states, and made appearances in 180 cities and towns. The idea was to recreate in reverse the trip Lincoln made to get from Illinois to Washington, D.C. when he was elected president. At every major city, Lincoln was actually removed from the train and laid in state in whatever important building was available. The ambitious plan put an enormous strain on the new embalming. Eventually, the strain became too much. Even with today's fancier techniques, anybody would be hard-pressed to make it through what Lincoln's was subjected to. Traveling thousands of miles is strenuous enough for the living, but Lincoln also went through many bumpy carriage journeys and was exposed to the elements for hours at a time. Keep in mind, there was also no refrigeration anywhere. Even with the attendant embalmer around to fix him up, Lincoln started to break down. By the time he made it to Manhattan, the president's face people saw was no longer a dignified Lincoln, but rather a ghastly shadow. Discoloration set in, and according to contemporary reports, he appeared wan and shrunken. Still, without the embalming, it would have been much, much worse. The New York Times said that as long as you hadn't actually known Lincoln when he was alive, then you would have been happy with how he looked. Even with the deterioration problems, Lincoln was still the most well-preserved person many people had ever seen. It was likely pretty mind-blowing for most folks to know that he had been gone for days but was still pretty well preserved. People put a lot of effort into getting a glimpse of the president. They waited in line for hours in all weather just to be able to see Lincoln and pay their final respects. Some even went around more than once, and many ex-slaves came to see the man. Although some might have been there out of a morbid curiosity, everyone seemed to take away at least one thing. When it came to the great beyond, embalming was the way of the future. The First Lady had already suffered a lot in life, having lost 2 of her sons when they were still children. After her husband's assassination, she was so grief-stricken she couldn't leave her bed. She didn't even sit up for 5 days. She was able to ask for her husband to be embalmed, but that was about it. Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, took over planning the funeral. He even overruled Mary Todd Lincoln when she asked that her husband be taken back to Illinois by the most direct route possible. So instead of personal mourning, the outpouring at Lincoln's death became public. While Mary thought her husband would have found this unseemly, historians still debate over what Lincoln himself actually would have thought. During his life, Lincoln believed in people having access to their politicians, so to many, it stands to reason that he would have felt the same in death. While the Civil War might have started the idea, once that conflict was over and embalming wasn't needed as much anymore, it could very well have disappeared. But Lincoln changed everything. With millions of people suddenly aware of embalming, the funeral industry underwent a revolution, and embalming only continued to grow in popularity. It became almost a trend at first. If embalming was good enough for the president, it was good enough for your family members. No more lying around for a day or two surrounded by candles to mask the smell. Now your loved ones could last longer, and bigger events could be held to commemorate them. Funerals became more ornate, and wakes even more popular. Viewing your loved one became something normal and almost nice, instead of grossly morbid. Embalming completely changed how people viewed death. In modern times, however, embalming might be on its way out. The chemicals used are harsh on the environment, and people are starting to look to greener ways to deal with the passing of a loved one. But it isn't gone yet, and the trend Lincoln started has been going strong for over a century and a half. Talk about being an influencer. American school children are taught that slaves in Confederate states were freed when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862. While true, the reality of actually freeing those slaves was far more complicated. Today, we're going to take a look at what actually happened on plantations when the slaves were freed. Okay, so let's head back to the days after the Civil War. You would think that once freed, the slaves would get off the plantations as fast as humanly possible. But in his autobiography, Booker T. Washington mentioned that many ex-slaves, especially older ones, decided to stay. Although free, these ex-slaves typically made deals with their former masters to work for pay. According to Washington, one by one, the older slaves began to wander from the slave quarters back to the big house to have a whispered conversation with their former owners as to the future. Thomas Rutling was only 9 when he and his fellow slaves learned of their emancipation. He thought freedom would mean his family would now live a life like their former master, but instead, the family chose to stay on the plantation another 2 years. Rutledge, along with his brother and sister, finally left the plantation in 1865. They went to live with a family in Nashville. He later attended the Fisk Free Colored School, which eventually became Fisk University. In her 1909 book, Memories of Childhood Slavery Days, ex-slave Annie L. Burton wrote of her own experiences with emancipation. Annie recalled that when the news reached the Alabama plantation she worked on, every slave who wasn't feeble or sickly left immediately. Some of these younger, healthier ex-slaves even immediately joined the Union Army. However, because their mother had run away, Annie and her younger sisters stayed behind under the care of their mistress. This may not have been the act of charity it appears to be. This same mistress tried to talk her husband into not telling the slaves about their freedom, and then made the feeble and sickly slaves who remained on the plantation work the fields. After the crops were planted, some plantation owners asked their ex-slaves to sign contracts guaranteeing they would work the crops until January. They would then be divided at the fall harvest for payment. Such a deal is mentioned in the Reverend Irving E. Lowry's 1911 book, Life on the Old Plantation in Antebellum Days, or A Story Based on Facts. Lowry said his ex-master tried to convince the slaves to sign the deals by making a long speech in which he reminded them that he wasn't a bad guy. The plantation owner pointed out that he never put an overseer over them, never employed bloodhounds, and never separated a mother from her child, nor a husband from his wife. He also told them that they were welcome to stay on his plantation as long as they'd like, and that any mistreatment they had experienced off the plantation was their own fault and not his. Although that argument might sound meager to us, all but one ex-slave signed the contract. Charles Hayes owned a plantation 16 miles north of Louisville, Kentucky. Like many slave owners, Hayes at first chose not to tell his slaves about emancipation at all. However, after a few days, he relented out of fear of being arrested. According to ex-slave Harry Smith in his 1891 book, 50 Years of Slavery in the United States of America, Hayes broke the news by saying, "I am about to tell you something I never expected to be obliged to tell you in my life. It is this: one and all, women, men, and children, belonging to me, you are free to go where you please." Smith also noted that at the same time, Hayes was cursing Lincoln's name and exclaiming that if Lincoln were there, he'd kill him for taking his slaves away. However, after Hayes cooled down, he gave the entire plantation access to his whiskey stash and threw what sounds like a pretty decent party. It was described as a great jubilee in which the ex-master and all the ex-slaves got drunk together. Smith recalls that everyone was cheering Abraham Lincoln, but Hayes was way too drunk to notice. By nightfall, the revelers had broken into song and dance and kept it up until morning. According to the Civil War diary of James T. Ayers, Charles Hayes was far from being the only master who tried to hide the news of emancipation from his slaves. Ayers was a Union recruiter who went into the South to enlist newly freed men into the Union Army. Things being as they were, he also often found himself as the person to inform the ex-slaves that they were, in fact, now free. In his diary entry for May 7, 1864, Ayers recorded spreading the word about emancipation to a group of 4 ex-slaves on a plantation near Huntsville, Alabama. He accomplished this by showing them a broadside that featured an illustration of freed slaves on one side and a 2-sentence version of the Emancipation Proclamation on the other. Ayers states the 4 men agreed to enlist, so he told them to gather their things, and he promised he would protect them. When they were confronted by their ex-master, Ayers drew his revolver and, sounding much like a hero in an action movie, calmly told the man, "I shall not hurt a hair of your head, sir, if you be quiet, but I have come for your slaves, and your slaves I'll have." It is believed that Ayers recruited hundreds of black soldiers to the Union cause and spread the word of emancipation to thousands before his death in September of 1865. According to his 1901 autobiography, Up from Slavery, the first day of freedom at the Virginia plantation where Booker T. Washington was born started with a simple, solemn meeting. The meeting was then followed by a reading of the Emancipation Proclamation by a government official, and the news was initially quite well received by the now former slaves. Washington recalled that the master's entire family had gathered on the veranda of the house. He got the impression that they were sad, not because of the loss of property, but rather because they were, in many ways, very close to some of the ex-slaves, who would now be leaving. He recalled his mother kissing her children while tears of joy ran down her cheeks. According to Washington, for some minutes there was great rejoicing and thanksgiving and wild scenes of ecstasy, but there was no feeling of bitterness. In fact, there was pity among the slaves for our former owners. Once the initial joy passed, however, many of the ex-slaves began to feel anxiety over what freedom would really mean. Washington observed, "The great responsibility of being free, of having charge of themselves, of having to think and plan for themselves and their children, seemed to take possession of them." He noted that some of the slaves were 70 or 80 years old and had no strength with which to earn a living. According to 1908's generously titled Memoirs of Samuel Spotswood Clement relating interesting experiences in days of slavery and freedom, Clement's ex-master, Taswood Ward, informed him and the other slaves on Ward's plantation of their freedom by reading to them from the newspaper. Spotswood recalled that when Mr. and Mrs. Ward came out of the house, he was holding a newspaper and she was crying. They walked to the front of the steps and he said, "Men and women, you are as free as the birds that fly in the air." Ward then raised the paper and read from it. He informed the ex-slaves that Lee had surrendered to Grant and the Southern Confederacy was at an end. He then offered to pay the men to stay and help reap the crops. The offer was accepted by all but one man. Known only as Uncle Fendel, the man was concerned that the rebels might pick up the fight again and revoke their freedom. There's somebody who's been around the block once or twice. Thomas Almond Ashby was 17 years old when he watched his father inform the family slaves on their Front Royal, Virginia plantation that they were all now free. In his 1914 memoir, The Valley Campaigns, Ashby recalled that his father told the ex-slaves that he had no further control over them, and that in the future he would pay them for their services based on wage rates established by the community. He told them that if they wished to stay in his employ, they could do so as long as they desired, but that if any of them wished to seek out a new home, he wouldn't try to stop them from making a change. The elder Ashby further assured the now freed people that he had nothing but a friendly desire to see them do well and be happy. He also warned them of the altered conditions that freedom would bring, and he urged them to cultivate habits of thrift and industry. He believed hard work would make them useful citizens and earn them self-respect, which is some pretty ironic advice coming from a slave owner. According to Ashby, it took several years before all of the ex-slaves had finally left the plantation. One, a woman known only as Aunt Susan, seemed to take Ashby's advice about thrift to heart. After saving up 3 years' worth of money she earned taking in the wash and doing light work, she was actually able to buy a neat little house in the city. Juneteenth, also known as Emancipation Day or Freedom Day, is an official holiday in the state of Texas and an unofficial American holiday that commemorates June 19, 1865. On that date, Union General Gordon Granger read from the federal proclamation that slavery was over in the state of Texas. While the Emancipation Proclamation had ended slavery in the Confederacy more than 2 years earlier, it took some time for the news to reach all parts of the war-torn states. Granger's proclamation guaranteed absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. It also declared that the connection between master and slave was officially replaced by that between employer and hired labor. During the late 19th century, Juneteenth was primarily celebrated by the black community. However, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s led to a renewed interest in the holiday at a wider level. In January of 1980, it became an official holiday in the state of Texas. And in the 21st century, it has become a widely recognized day to celebrate black historical achievements and encourage respect and pride in all cultures. Abraham Lincoln, long considered one of America's greatest presidents, met his fate at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. on the night of April 14, 1865. The true motives of his assassin, an actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth, have been debated since that night. But regardless of what Booth's ends may have been, his action changed history and the course of a nation. Today, we're going to examine the timeline of the hunt for John Wilkes Booth. Okay, so let's see how they captured one of the most infamous assassins in U.S. history. When Abraham Lincoln won re-election as president in 1864, John Wilkes Booth and his fellow conspirators formed a plan. They would kidnap Lincoln, then trade him back to the government in exchange for the release of Confederate prisoners of war. They also formed several contingency plans. One plot aimed to intercept Lincoln in March of 1865 while he was on the road, but a change in the president's schedule nixed that idea. Another included capturing Lincoln at Ford's Theater and then lowering him out of his box using ropes. However, the Civil War was winding down and a Union victory was becoming increasingly certain. The release of POWs wouldn't make a difference anymore, so Booth resolved to take a more drastic and bloody course. Killing Lincoln was only supposed to be the tip of the iceberg. Booth's full plan actually called for something like the climax of the movie Casino. He and his fellow conspirators intended to kill 4 key Union officials that night. The other targets were Vice President Andrew Johnson, Secretary of State William Seward, and Union General Ulysses S. Grant. The idea was to throw the entire Union side into chaos by taking out the leadership. This supposedly would give the Confederacy time to regroup and attack Washington. When the night came, Booth used the connections he acquired as an actor to sneak into Ford's Theater. When Lincoln was distracted watching a play called My American Cousin, Booth entered the box, pulled out a Derringer pistol, and, at 10:15 p.m., shot Lincoln in the back of the head. Booth had no way of knowing it at the time, but this assassination would be the only one of the four planned to actually succeed. After he fired the fatal shot, Booth rushed past the witnesses and tried to leap to the stage below. Henry Rathbone, an Army officer, attempted to stop him, but Booth stabbed Rathbone in the shoulder. Immediately after, Booth leapt to the stage, landing awkwardly, breaking his leg. The theater audience sat in confusion. Some thought the goings-on were part of the play until they heard the First Lady screaming. Booth stood up on stage and yelled 3 Latin words that would ring down through history. Sic semper tyrannis, which in English means, thus always to tyrants. For the record, he didn't write that himself. The phrase Sic semper tyrannis was historically associated with Brutus and the assassins of Julius Caesar. Interestingly, Booth had once acted the part of Brutus in a play. The phrase was also the state motto of Virginia. The president was dead. The atmosphere in the theater turned to chaos. Soldiers flooded the building. Booth knew he had to flee the city as quickly as possible. A co-conspirator had arranged for a horse to be waiting for him at the stage door. Booth jumped on the steed and crossed the Navy Yard Bridge into Maryland. Booth was met on the other side by a conspirator named David Harold. They rode together to a town called Surrattsville, Maryland. There they went to Surratt's Tavern, whose proprietors were hiding some supplies for the men. Knowing that the army would be hot on their trail, they didn't stay long. They gathered what they needed, armed themselves heavily, and headed back on the road. At 4 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, Booth and Harold arrived in Maryland at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Mudd set Booth's broken leg and let the two men rest at his home for a few hours. While Mudd was a small-town physician who was known to be sympathetic to the Confederacy, it is unclear whether he knew Booth and Harold or were aware of what they had done. He would later deny any knowledge of the conspiracy, but it didn't do him much good. They sent him to prison anyway. Regardless, once he was strong enough, Booth and his partner hit the road again. They got lost in a swamp and then paid a farmer to help them find Rich Hill, which was the home of another Confederate sympathizer named Samuel Cox. Slowed by Booth's leg, the two men wouldn't arrive until 1 a.m. the next morning. Samuel Cox may have been sympathetic to Booth and Harold's case, but he was also acutely aware of the danger they posed to himself. Over 1,000 Union soldiers had been mobilized to search for Booth, and a bounty placed on the conspirators had reached $100,000, roughly the modern equivalent of $1.5 million. If Cox was caught aiding and abetting the fugitives, the consequences would have been severe. Knowing this, Cox sent Booth and Harold to a nearby pine thicket at the edge of his property. That would give them the chance to watch for an opportunity to cross the Potomac into Virginia and would give Cox plausible deniability if they were caught. Booth, for his part, was furious that Cox wouldn't let them in the house. Nonetheless, they stayed in the thicket and tried to adjust. Booth and Harold stayed in the pine thicket for a total of 4 days. On occasion, a friend of Cox named Thomas Jones would bring some food, drink, and copies of the newspapers. This was how Booth first learned that he was being almost universally condemned as a villain and a coward. Having considered his act heroic, Booth was genuinely shocked. In his diary, he compared himself to historical figures like William Tell and Marcus Junius Brutus, wondering why he was being considered a common cutthroat while they were lauded as heroes. It's unknown when Booth began keeping this diary, but the document remains the only first-hand account of Booth's thoughts during this time. It is from this diary that we know on April 18th, a column of Union soldiers passed within 600 feet of the pine thicket. Concerned that their horses would give them away, Harold chose to silence the animals. While Booth and Harold continued to lay low and drink whiskey, the country was mourning a president. Back in Washington, D.C., thousands of people came out to watch the funeral procession that carried Lincoln's body to the Capitol building. A private service was held for important figures and those close to Lincoln. The following day, the rotunda was opened to the public. Citizens came in droves to say goodbye to their president. The following day, his body was loaded onto a special train that would carry it to its final resting place in Springfield, Illinois. 6 days after the assassination, the soldiers searching for Booth moved out of the area near Cox's home. Thomas Jones informed the fugitives, and at dusk on April 20th, they set out again. Though the Potomac was only 3.5 miles away, progress was likely slow due to Booth's leg. When they finally did reach the water, Jones put the two men in a small skiff. Refusing payment for his services, Jones put the two men out on the river and parted ways with them. Unfortunately for Booth and Harold, the night was foggy and navigation was difficult. Rather than land at Muchudoc Creek in Virginia as planned, they got lost and ended up in Maryland. On the 21st, the fugitives managed to get supplies from a farmhouse near the creek. They returned to the boat where, for reasons that remain unclear to this very day, they did nothing. Historians speculate Booth's leg may have been acting up or that the two men may have heard rumors of Union patrols in the area, but the truth is lost to history. All we know is that, rather than escaping down the Potomac as planned, the fugitives spent the night of April 21st at Nanjamoni Creek in Maryland. The fugitives headed out again the following evening. It was again foggy, but now the mist was working in their favor by helping them get down the river unseen. Booth's diary records a close call. The skiff crossed into the path of a Union gunboat, but they managed to avoid a collision and the fog kept them unseen. Meanwhile, Union forces were drawing the noose tighter around the two men. Back in Maryland, Dr. Mudd's house was surrounded by troops, and the proprietors of Surratt's Tavern had been arrested. The Army knew Booth was heading to Virginia and began to flood the roads there with soldiers. On the morning of April 23rd, the fugitives reached Virginia. They immediately made contact with a sympathizer named Elizabeth Queensberry, who fed them and then sent them to meet with a Dr. Richard Stewart. They successfully reached Stewart's home, but as soon as he learned who they were, Stewart kicked Booth and Harold out. In need of shelter, the men decided to head to the cabin of a free black man named William Lucas. Like Stewart, Lucas refused to let the fugitives spend the night. Angry and desperate, Booth threatened Lucas with a knife and then made him and his family spend the night on their own porch. The following day, Booth and Harold forced Lucas's son to take them to Port Charles. There, the fugitives met a former Confederate soldier named Willie Jett. Jett offered to hide the men in a house he had arranged for, but the house was being occupied by two unmarried women. Ooh la la. The presidential assassin and his partner felt it would be improper for them to stay there under those conditions, so they continued on. On April 24th, Booth and Harold reached a farmhouse owned by a man named Richard Garrett, whom they did not know. Booth, perhaps using his acting skills, convinced Garrett that he and Harold were soldiers and that Booth's leg had been broken in the course of his duties. Garrett fell for the ruse and gave the men a place to sleep for the night. The following day, Booth slept late, got drunk, and played with Garrett's children. By that evening, the family had grown suspicious of the fugitives and insisted they spend the night in the barn. Booth agreed and headed to his new lodging for some sleep. It would be the last night of sleep he would ever get. While Booth and Harold slept, the Union troops closed in. Willie Jett, the Confederate soldier who had tried to help them escape, had tipped off the authorities as to the fugitives' whereabouts. At approximately 2:30 a.m. on April 26th, Booth was awakened by the sound of horses approaching the barn. It was the cavalry. He woke Harold and the two tried to escape. What they didn't know is that shortly after they went to sleep, the Garretts, who were fearful the fugitives would steal their horses, had locked them into the barn. They were trapped. The Union forces surrounded the barn. They had orders from Secretary of War Edwin Stanton to take Booth alive, so a standoff ensued. Harold, for his part, begged Booth to let him surrender. Booth agreed and let Harold go, but he had other plans for himself. As the standoff dragged on, the Union soldiers began to surround the barn with kindling. Booth could tell they meant business, and that his time was running out. He tried to avoid his fate by challenging the commander of the Union forces to a duel for his freedom, but the soldiers weren't having any of that. The kindling was lit, and the barn went up in flames. Booth charged out and was quickly shot by a soldier named Boston Corbett. In his final moments, Booth asked one of the soldiers to hold up his hand so he could see them. The soldiers obliged, and while looking over his hand, Booth spoke his final words: "Useless, useless." Then at 7:15 a.m., John Wilkes Booth shuffled off this mortal coil.
Sometimes fate has strange designs on the lives of mortal men. You think you're just a wholesale grocer one day, and the next, you have a front row seat to the largest domestic military conflict in American history. And that's exactly what happened to a man named Wilmer McLean. who holds the bizarre distinction of owning the property where the battle for our nation's soul took place, twice. So, today we're investigating how the Civil War started and ended at the same guy's house. Born May 3, 1814, Wilmer McLean worked as a wholesale grocer. Given his place in American history, we'd love to be able to tell you he was a standard bearer for contemporary ideals. But he was actually exceedingly pro-Confederate, like super-duper Confederate, a full-on slave owner who married a wealthy widow in 1853 and began running a sizable plantation. And by all estimates, McLean was a very successful dude. Of course, it didn't hurt that he married into a wealthy family, because that served as a backbone for many of his initial entrepreneurial efforts. But it is impressive that he managed to pull it off with his notably Lincoln-esque facial hair. Lincoln not being terribly popular in the South at the time, for whatever reason. Anyway, the property McLean owned was located in Prince William County, right behind the Potomac River in the Commonwealth of Virginia. That property featured a small moving body of water called the Bull Run Stream, which might sound familiar to anyone who took elementary school level history, as it was the site of the First Battle of Bull Run, the first major skirmish of the Civil War. In 1861, Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard commandeered McLean's property as the headquarters of the Confederate troops. This sounds pretty aggressive, but back in those days, it was actually a fairly standard wartime practice on every side of the political spectrum. Historically speaking, there are countless stories of insurgent military operations setting up headquarters in the sizable homes of affluent individuals during various occupations or invasions. Every army does it, but the Confederates didn't exactly pick the McLean farm at random. In fact, they didn't pick it all. It was offered to them. According to General Beauregard, McLean provided the Confederacy with valuable intelligence about the area and even offered up the buildings on his farm to the Confederate troops. That included his home, as well as his barn, which was converted into a military hospital. Yes, thanks to his Confederate leanings, as well as the fact that he was a retired officer in the Virginia militia, McLean was ready, willing, and generally eager to help with the war effort. If he had been a younger man, he probably would have even re-enlisted. But unfortunately for him, he was 47 and too old to endure active duty again. It's also worth noting that by that point in his life, McLean had way too much to lose. Specifically, a wife, a plantation, and oodles of money that he had accrued speculating on sugar and other commodities. Nonetheless, he invited the Southern Army into his home, which immediately led to some hilarious sitcom-style hijinks. For example, on July 18, 1861, Beauregard was eating supper in the kitchen when a cannonball tore through the structure and landed squarely in the kitchen fireplace. You might not find that so funny, but Beauregard would record in his diary, "A comical effect of this artillery fight was the destruction of the dinner of myself and staff by a Federal shell that fell into the fireplace of my headquarters at the McLean house." Anyway, the initial battle of the Civil War would begin on McLean's farm just 3 days later, on July 21, 1861. As we alluded to before, it was called the First Battle of Bull Run, or alternatively, the Battle of First Manassas. That being said, we respectfully request that you hold your Manassas jokes until the end. Whatever you want to call it, the battle was notable because it set a pretty dark tone for the prospective war. Beauregard led the Confederate forces, and Brigadier General Irvin McDowell led the Union forces. Each side had about 18,000 troops, and neither had quite mastered the art of, well, organizing them. In any way, at all, really. Accounts of the battle characterize it as brutal, sloppy, and almost comically disorganized. Long story short, the Confederates won, and the Union forces retreated after their defeat. The Union forces weren't the only ones to flee McLean's farm. McLean and his family had fled right before the battle started, so as to not get killed. But after the Confederacy victory, they decided to return. Surveying the carnage, McLean was recommitted to his cause. He helped house the Confederate wounded in his barn, and after sorting out some internal conflict, he worked to bring in wounded Union soldiers as well. Starting around this time, McLean began working for the Confederate quartermaster. That means he would sell the Confederates the food and supplies that the war effort demanded. However, as time passed, McLean ever the businessman, started to charge them more and more. He brokered sugar and other essentials and managed to make quite a pretty penny off the whole deal. One sergeant even complained on the record about the very exorbitant prices at Manassas. As if one major Civil War battle in his front yard wasn't enough, the Second Battle of Bull Run was fought from August 28th through August 30th, 1862, and it happened in pretty much the same place. Only this battle was much bigger than the first. This time, the big guns showed up, both literally and metaphorically. Over 77,000 soldiers fought for the North and roughly 50,000 for the South, and the generals in charge were John Pope and Robert E. Lee. The Confederates, assisted by multiple strategic moments of brilliance by Stonewall Jackson, won again. Over 15,000 Union troops perished or went missing during the battle. Given his Confederate leanings, you'd think McClellan would be delighted, but not so much. In fact, he had had enough. And despite how much money he was making off the whole thing, he packed up his pregnant wife and got the hell out of there, for good. In the spring of 1863, McClellan uprooted his whole life and set out in pursuit of greener and decidedly less blood-soaked pastures. To that end, he moved his family approximately 120 miles south to Appomattox County, Virginia, where they settled near a community called the Appomattox Courthouse. McClellan later told a friend that he left Manassas with the hope that he'd never see another soldier again. That, however, would not be the case for him. Far from it. McClellan had 2 good years in Appomattox, but on April 9, 1865, an aide to General Lee arrived at his property. He asked McClellan what might be a good meeting spot for Lee and another general, and McClellan, who probably just wanted to get that guy the hell out of there, suggested a dilapidated house nearby. But the marshal didn't like it. He was concerned over safety risks, so McClellan reluctantly offered his own home as a meeting spot. On the appointed day, Lee, looking clean and spiffy, met Ulysses Grant, who was decidedly less spiffy, being covered in mud and looking fairly beleaguered. It's an interesting sign of the weird dynamic at play. Lee wanted to go out with honor, whereas Grant just wanted that shit to be over. The two generals chewed the fat in McClellan's parlor for 20 minutes or so, and then, with the obligatory chit-chat out of the way, Lee finally brought up the topic of the meeting, the Confederate surrender. After that, it only took a few minutes for the Civil War to officially be over, and, spoiler alert, the South lost. But they weren't the only losers that day. Apparently, soldiers looking for souvenirs of the occasion cleaned out the McClellan house. According to contemporary reports, one a-hole even took his little girl's doll. After the war ended, the McClellans found themselves unable to keep up with their mortgage payments, so they sold their house in Appomattox and returned to Manassas. They weren't happy there either, though, so then they moved to Alexandria, Virginia, where McClellan worked for the IRS from 1873 to 1876. He died in Alexandria in 1882 and is buried at St. Paul's Episcopal Cemetery, in case you want to visit or something. Fast forward to today, and the arc of history has nearly completely forgotten McClellan's name. Nevertheless, he was a linchpin spectator in the course of our country. He was a witness to the beginning and the end of the greatest military conflict to ever take place on American soil. He provided infrastructure, assistance, and grew fat off the conflict. He also saw the carnage up close, and it deeply affected him. The fact that the Civil War opened and closed on homes owned by Wilmer McClellan, by complete coincidence, is nothing short of bizarre. Heck, it would be a strange factoid even if McClellan wasn't desperately attempting to flee the impact of the war when he moved to Appomattox. But he was, and he failed. Because apparently, fate is a bitch, and we can't outrun our past, no matter how hard we try. But the point is, Wilmer McClellan was a man defined by the chaos of his times. He profited off it, he accelerated it, and didn't even try to rebel against the demons that appeared at his doorstep. And therein lies the real lessons of this story. First, don't attempt to turn a blind eye to the horrors committed in your front yard, so to speak. They will catch up to you, either literally or metaphorically, or both. And second, never offer your farm to the Confederate Army to use as a headquarters, or to two Civil War generals looking for a meeting spot, or you'll die working for the IRS in Virginia. Oh, you laugh, but it could happen to you as easily as it did to Wilmer McClellan.
On April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was gunned down by Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, abandoned his predecessor's plans for Reconstruction and ultimately proved incapable of unifying the deeply fractured nation. Southern states quickly saw an onslaught of new legal mechanisms designed to retain economic power of Southern landowners and oppress Black Americans. The effects of the Reconstruction period would shape the Southern United States to this very day. Today, we're going to take a look at what life was actually like in the South during the Reconstruction. So let's head back to a precarious time in American history. Whether oblivious, bigoted, or living behind a thick wall of denial, many members of the Southern elite believed their slaves were A-OK with living in bondage. While the abolitionist movement took root in the late 1700s and the prohibition of slavery had been codified in all northern states by around the turn of the century, some land-owning Southern elites scoffed at the idea, feeling very sure their slaves were happy right where they were. So, when the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865, abolishing slavery and involuntary servitude throughout the United States, those Southern elites were pretty confused when their former slaves quit and left. This shock quickly soured into a festering resentment that was directed at those freed slaves who wanted to actually pursue freedom. That resentment turned into action, as those landowners then searched for alternative legal means to reinstate their hold over the Black population and thus secure the cheap labor the landowners had relied upon. Those that visited the South before the Civil War, the antebellum South, often noted the region's warm and hospitable attitude towards visitors, if they were white. However, when the Civil War ended, that day-to-day positivity disappeared, along with the money that once lined the pockets of Southern landowners. A contributor for Scribner's Monthly even wrote that there was no longer the spirit to maintain the grand, unbounded hospitality once so characteristic of the South. For it was a grand and lordly life, that of the owner of a sugar plantation, filled with culture, pleasure, and the refinement of living. But now, in other words, life gets harder without slave labor. As for the Black communities of the South, their initial hope and optimism over the North's victory in the Civil War was deflated when expected economic gains failed to materialize. In 1865, Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau to help millions of former Black slaves and poor whites after the Civil War. The Bureau provided food, housing and medical aid, established schools, negotiated labor contracts, and offered legal assistance. It also assisted former slaves to settle on land liberated during the war. Between 1865 and 1870, the Freedmen's Bureau founded and managed over 3,000 schools across the South. These schools were created for learning at every level, and it was during this time that Fisk University, Howard University, Hampton University, and several more of the nation's first Black colleges were established. Though the establishment of these schools was an achievement, many didn't receive support from their state governments, who were often hostile to them. There often wasn't enough money for proper buildings, much less qualified teachers or books. Even with those shortcomings, attendance by Black students skyrocketed. And while the number of minority students rose during the Reconstruction, the attendance of white students dwindled. The economy in the antebellum South basically amounted to a small pool of landed gentry making big money by exploiting cheap labor in the form of slavery. When the Civil War ended and Congress banned slavery, those previously wealthy white landowners found their income greatly diminished. Making matters worse, most of the Southern elite had converted their fortunes into now worthless Confederate currency when the South seceded. Should have put it in Bitcoin. The cumulative loss of wealth for everyone involved is estimated at $500 million. Of course, these elites still owned considerable stretches of farmland, which was precisely the asset they would leverage to reestablish their fortunes. While historians believe Abraham Lincoln would have included considerable federal oversight throughout the Reconstruction years, that was not Andrew Johnson's style. Johnson believed that apart from enforcing the abolition of slavery, swearing public loyalty to the Union, and repaying their debts, the Southern states should be allowed to rebuild their infrastructure without interference from the federal government. As a result, political leaders in each state set out to reestablish the Old South in a new form. Black people were technically free, but would not be allowed to vote or hold office. Any land that had been granted by federal troops was ultimately returned to the previous owners. Johnson's actions ultimately got him impeached by the Republican-controlled House and Senate, but the damage was already done. His inattentiveness aided in the creation of thousands of freedmen who had no property nor the means to acquire it. In the first years of Reconstruction, Northerners, many of whom were former Union soldiers, moved to the South to make some money and exert political influence over the region. Named for their signature carpet satchels, these carpetbaggers worked as merchants, teachers, journalists, and more. While they were met with hostility by locals, they were instrumental in educating a new generation of young black people and helping them get involved with and find a foothold in local politics. When the Southern economy collapsed, elite Southern women, many of whom had led pampered lives, were forced to perform household tasks that had always been performed by slaves. This meant learning how to pump water, clean their homes, prepare meals, and tend to a variety of other manual chores. Some of these women negotiated with their former house slaves to keep them on, in the same way their husbands might have negotiated land shares with former slaves. And because so many men were incapacitated as a result of injuries suffered in the war, some women had to take over the land that had been left untended. White Southern landowners were armed with thousands of acres of land and the tools to farm it, but they didn't have any money to pay people to work. Confederate cash was worth less than the paper it was printed on. Meanwhile, newly freed black Americans, many of whom had no skills beyond those they once performed as slaves, needed a means to earn a living. As a result, former slaveholders often struck a deal with their former slaves. The arrangement came to be called sharecropping. The average black sharecropper's day was filled with farming a stretch of land that was technically their own, so long as they supplied the real landowner with enough crops at harvest. However, the tools they used were often rented on credit because they had no money. Since it was nearly impossible for these sharecroppers to feed their family and make enough money to pay back the landowner for the tools, a cycle of debt evolved that left black freemen economically dependent on Southern landowners. While some consider the Reconstruction a blazing trash fire, some good things did come from it. One of those things was that many black families who had been previously torn apart through slavery were finally able to be reunited. In the years after the war, former slaves found themselves with options that were once unthinkable. They had the opportunity to move out of slave quarters, build individual homes on their plots of land, marry one another, and, at least theoretically, raise families without fear of reprisal. In some instances, the chaos following the Civil War saw slaves rise up and take their former owners' land and home by force. While that may sound like poetic justice, President Johnson didn't like that poem. Amnesty for the defeated Southern landowners in exchange for allegiance to the Union, along with plain old politics, led Johnson to direct federal troops to step in and return the seized land to the ex-slave owners to whom it previously belonged. For similar reasons, Johnson also reversed General William Tecumseh Sherman's land redistribution plan, which had been implemented with Special Field Orders 15 during the war. Later, various legislative efforts for land redistribution failed to gain necessary political support. Interests were torn between appeasement and reconciliation with the South and radical Republican desire to dismantle the plantation system. As a result, most slaves were left with little opportunity to own land in the South, compelled either into a life of sharecropping or to relocate to greater opportunity, but equipped with few skills or resources to do so. While black Southerners were now technically free under federal law, the reality on the ground was starkly different. States like Mississippi passed regulations that compelled black people to get written evidence of employment every single January. Those black people found to be working without such a contract, or any who chose to leave their property before their contract was out, would forfeit any previous earnings and open themselves up to arrest. The net effect was that a lot of black sharecroppers found that their day-to-day existence looked a lot like their days as slaves. They were still working the same land, and they were effectively incapable of leaving. Free blacks who wanted to find work in non-farming arenas were faced with a few problems. They had limited financial resources and had skills primarily related to agricultural work. Plus, their local governments worked diligently to make sure change was not easy for them. For example, during Reconstruction in South Carolina, the legislature passed a law that mandated blacks who took work as anything other than a farmer or servant would be subject to a tax of up to $100 a year. This meant black people who moved to Charleston seeking an administrative or clerical position, or who endeavored to become an artist or craftsman, found their ambitions saddled with a formidable economic burden. Several states throughout the South passed laws that made it legal for black people to serve out prison terms by working on plantations. So, any black artisans unable to pay their taxes? Any former slaves arrested and convicted of vagrancy? Or any sharecropper unable to pay their rent could be arrested and sentenced to work on a plantation. This looks familiar. Didn't we just fight a war to end that? For those Southerners who did not own land, the end of the war saw no immediate change to their daily life. But that wouldn't last too long. Crops from free black farmers that entered the market increased competition, creating downward pressure on prices. This impacted the lives of poor white Southern farmers. The competition between these groups, both struggling for survival, created resentment between blacks and poor whites. So what do you think? What went right and what went wrong with Reconstruction? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.